prairie wind carried secrets across the desolate plains, each gust whispering of promises made, hearts broken and blood spilled in the name of survival. The land itself was a character, cruel and unrelenting, yet shimmering with the possibility of redemption for those willing to stake their lives upon its soil, under the raw expanse of the western sky. Where the sun bled crimson at dusk and coyotes mourned in the distance, fate gathered its players, outlaws, brides, sheriffs, and dreamers, each unknowingly stepping toward a collision that would scar them, shape them, and perhaps save them. At the center was Whispered Mustang, a man whose name carried like smoke across saloons and campfires. No one could say if Whispered was born to him or earned through his way of moving. Soft as wind through dry grass, silent until it was too late. He was a Mustang tamed by no one, scarred by nights in outlaw camps, yet gentled by something he rarely spoke of. His dark eyes carried storms. His hands bore calluses from reins and revolvers. But his voice, when he chose to use it, could disarm as swiftly as his pistol. Her name was Sweetheart, though no man had ever dared call her so until him. She had arrived in a rattling stagecoach, little more than a shadow wrapped in a faded dress, the last in a long line of mail-order brides sent west with nothing but paper promises and a prayer. She carried scars too, ones no eye could see, though they guided every step she took. She had come to this land not seeking love but survival, hoping that by binding herself to a stranger she might escape the cruelties of her past. Yet even in her resolve, the wide-open plains stirred a dormant yearning within her, a reckless hunger for more than just endurance. Their paths collided on the edge of a storm. She was standing at the rail of a half-built corral, hair whipping wild in the wind, staring at the mustangs penned within. They bucked and fought, their cries echoing her own caged spirit. Whispered watched her from the shadows, drawn not by beauty alone but by the way she stood unflinching against the wind, as if she dared the world to break her again. "You look at them like you understand," he said at last, his voice carrying the weight of dust and sorrow. She turned, startled, eyes flashing like flint. "Maybe I do. Maybe I'm no different than they are. Wild once, but now expected to carry the plow." A silence stretched between them, thick as the storm brewing above. Then his lips curved, not quite a smile, more a recognition. "Sweetheart," he whispered, the word falling like a secret only they shared. "You're stronger than a Mustang." The name clung to her, as dangerous as it was tender. No man had ever called her sweetheart without cruelty, yet from his mouth the word felt like a rope cast into the dark, offering not capture but salvation. But the West allowed little room for tenderness. Within days, the first signs of trouble emerged. A bounty rider brought word that a band of outlaws men Whispered once rode with had been seen trailing near town. They were searching for something or someone. The townsfolk grew uneasy, casting wary glances toward Whispered. He was a man who lived between law and lawlessness, and suspicion followed him like dust on boots. Sweetheart found herself tangled in that suspicion, her new life threatened before it had begun. Whispers of her past crept through saloons, rumors of a husband back east, of debts unpaid, of reasons she fled. She felt the weight of every eye on her, questioning, judging. Survival in the West demanded strength, but strength came at a cost. Trust no one, love no one, risk nothing. And yet each time Whispered Mustang drew near, each time his eyes met hers, she felt the dangerous pull of wanting more. The storm finally broke one night when the outlaws rode in. The saloon doors swung wide. Boots pounded against floorboards, and violence came like a flood. Whispered's hand hovered near his revolver, but his glance flicked to her, steady and sure, as if telling her without words, "Hold fast." The gunfight that followed left smoke curling in the rafters and blood staining the floor. Justice in the West was swift, brutal, and never clean. When silence returned, Sweetheart stood trembling in the shadows, her breath ragged. Whispered approached, his hat tipped low, his shirt torn by a grazing bullet. He reached for her hand, rough, scarred, yet gentle. "It hurts," she gasped, clutching her chest. Whether from fear or longing, she could not say. His whisper came again, low and certain, the kind of vow only a man who had lost everything before could give. "But you want more, and Sweetheart, out here wanting more is the bravest thing you can do." And so their story began. Born not in peace but in fire, not in certainty but in the wild gamble of hearts who dared to want more than survival. The morning after the gunfight, the town lay wrapped in a brittle silence. Smoke still clung to the air, mingling with the acrid scent of gunpowder and spilled whiskey. Men shoveled sand over the blood-dark stains on the saloon floor, while women stood in doorways with weary eyes, whispering among themselves. The West had no shortage of violence, but this night had cut deeper. The outlaws hadn't come for money or drink. They had come for Whispered Mustang. Sweetheart sat on the edge of a borrowed bed above the saloon, her hands trembling as she tried to lace her boots. Each tug of the leather string reminded her of how fragile her place in this town was, how easily she might be cast out if whispers of her past gained too much weight. She had seen judgment before, back east in parlors where polite smiles concealed daggers. But here in the West, judgment came quicker, harsher, and often carried the steel of a revolver. Whispered leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, his dark gaze steady on her. He bore his own wounds from the night before, a raw cut along his temple, a bruise spreading across his ribs. But he carried the pain as if it were nothing. The only thing that stirred in him now was concern, and not for himself. They weren't just passing through, he said quietly. They were looking for me. His words settled like a heavy stone between them. Sweetheart paused, her breath hitching. She had known from the first time she heard his name that Whispered Mustang was not a man untouched by shadows, but hearing it confirmed made her heart drum with unease. Why? She asked, her voice brittle as the prairie grass. He didn't answer at once. Instead, he walked to the window, pushing aside the faded curtain. Outside, the sky stretched endless, a blue so wide it mocked the smallness of men and their secrets. Whispered's jaw tightened as he spoke. Because once I rode with them. I thought I could leave that life behind. I thought, maybe I could be something else. His eyes flicked to hers, a storm gathering in their depths. But men like them don't forget. They don't forgive. Sweetheart's chest tightened. She had run west to escape her own past, and now she had tethered herself to a man bound to his. Survival had always meant distance for her, never letting anyone close enough to drag her back into the darkness. But Whispered was different. His scar spoke the same language as hers. He was broken in familiar ways, yet he carried himself as if daring the world to strike again. She should have pulled away. She should have told him she wanted no part in his war. But instead she found herself whispering, "Then you'll need someone at your side, even if the whole town turns against you." The silence that followed was not empty but heavy, charged with something unsaid. Whispered studied her as if searching for a lie. But all he saw was truth. By sundown, the whispers in town had swelled into suspicion. Mothers clutched their children tighter when Sweetheart passed. Men muttered into their whiskey that women who arrived by stagecoach carried more secrets than the mailbags strapped to the driver's seat. They said Whispered had brought trouble with him, and now that trouble threatened to spread like wildfire. And trouble did come, this time not in gunfire, but in the raw cruelty of the land itself. A storm rolled down from the north, fierce as a war party. Winds howled across the plains, driving snow before them in blinding waves. The town was swallowed whole by white, its buildings groaning under the weight of ice. It was not the quick fury of a desert squall, but the grinding siege of winter. Merciless and unrelenting, Sweetheart and Whispered found themselves trapped in a drafty cabin at the edge of town. The roof leaked, the firewood dwindled, and every board creaked with the strain of the storm. Survival demanded they huddle close, bodies pressed together for warmth. The distance she had always kept melted away with each breath that fogged the air between them. She confessed then, in a voice so soft it nearly vanished beneath the wind's scream, that she had not come west for love. She had come to escape. A husband left behind, debts unpaid, nights filled with fists instead of tenderness. She had been promised freedom, but freedom had come in the form of exile. Whispered listened without judgment. When she faltered, when shame coiled around her words, he reached for her hand and held it steady. "Out here," he whispered. "The past don't own you unless you let it. You can build something new, but it'll hurt. Every time you reach for more, it'll hurt." Tears stung her eyes, not from weakness, but from the sudden, searing realization that she wanted exactly what he spoke of. More. Not just to survive, not just to outlast the storm, but to carve out a life that was hers, even if it came at a cost. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, in the dim flicker of firelight, Whispered Mustang and Sweetheart made a vow that was not spoken in words, but in the fierce way they clung to each other. Their pasts were heavy, their enemies close. But for the first time in years, both dared to believe in tomorrow. And yet, shadows waited beyond the horizon. The outlaws would return, fiercer than before. The town would grow colder, not from winter but from mistrust and love. if that was truly what was blooming, would demand more from them than either had yet given. The storm passed, but it did not leave peace in its wake. When the snow melted, it revealed more than frostbitten fences and broken roofs. It uncovered the fragile seams holding the town together. Suspicion clung like soot, heavier with every glance, every whispered word in the saloon. Men said Whispered Mustang had brought ruin with him, and women eyed Sweetheart as if she carried a sickness. The West was no stranger to hardship, but hardship made people cruel, and cruelty bred fear. Sweetheart tried to walk among them with her chin high, her shawl wrapped tight against the biting air, but she felt their judgment with every step. She knew what they saw, a woman without a past she dared to name, a woman too close to a man who bore the weight of outlaw blood. She wanted to scream at them that she had survived worse than their glares, that she had endured nights darker than any storm, but words would not change their hearts. Only deeds could, and even then, the West was slow to forgive. Whispered Mustang carried himself differently. He did not flinch from their stares, did not bend to their mutters. He worked harder, mending fences, hauling timber, offering his back where others turned away. But even as he labored, he felt the pull of his past like rains cutting into flesh. The men he once rode with had not been crushed in that gunfight. They had only been warned. And warnings did not stop wolves. They only made them hungrier. One evening, word came that a rancher's cattle had been driven off into the canyon. Tracks in the snow showed horses, wild, fast, but guided. It was outlaw work, and the town turned their eyes to Whispered, a man who knew their tricks, a man who once rode that path. The sheriff cornered him outside the saloon, his badge glinting in the lantern light. They're yours to deal with, Mustang. If you want this town to believe you've changed, prove it. Ride after them. It was not a request, but a sentence. If Whispered refused, he was guilty in their eyes. If he went, he risked facing the very men who had once called him brother. Sweetheart stepped forward then, her voice steady though her hands shook. He won't ride alone. The sheriff's laugh was bitter. This ain't a place for women, but Whispered silenced him with a look. He had no right to ask her, no right to risk her life, yet something in her eyes, the same fire that had stood unbroken against the storm, told him she would follow whether he allowed it or not. And so, they rode at dawn. The land stretched cold and empty, each hoofbeat cracking against the frozen earth. The canyon loomed ahead, jagged walls painted red by the rising sun, a place where echoes turned whispers into shouts and shadows could swallow a man whole. As they descended, Sweetheart felt fear coiled tight in her chest, but alongside it was something more dangerous, trust. She had trusted no man in years, yet now she rode beside Whispered Mustang, her pulse steadying with every glance he cast her way. In the canyon's depths, they found signs of the stolen herd, hoof prints scattered in the sand, a brand scorched from the flank of a steer to mask its owner. Then came the laughter, low and sharp, bouncing from rock to rock until it surrounded them. The outlaws emerged from the shadows like ghosts, faces she did not know, but Whispered did. He knew each scar, each sneer, each hand that rested too easily on a pistol. Their leader, a man with eyes like a rattlesnake, grinned. Well, look what the wind blew back to us. The quiet one, Whispered Mustang. Thought you could leave us, did you? Thought you could walk away and play rancher? Sweetheart's breath caught. This was no ordinary standoff. This was a reckoning. Whispered's voice was low, steady, but laced with steel. I'm not the man I was, the outlaw laughed. Men like us don't change. We bleed the same till we're buried. His eyes flicked to Sweetheart then, cold and cruel. And who's this? Your weakness. Sweetheart's hand tightened on the reins, but before fear could consume her, Whispered shifted his horse between her and the danger. His body was a shield, his stance a vow. She's mine, he said, the words a whisper yet sharp enough to cut. And if you touch her, you'll see just how much a Mustang can fight. The canyon seemed to hold its breath. Hands hovered near pistols, horses stamped nervously, and in the midst of it, Sweetheart realized something. She was no longer just surviving. She was fighting for something, for someone, and the fire of it burned hotter than her fear. The first shot cracked like thunder, and chaos erupted. Bullets ricocheted off stone. Horses reared and smoke choked the air. Sweetheart clung to her saddle, her heart hammering as Whispered drew his revolver with a speed born of years he'd sworn to forget. He fought not for gold, not for glory, but for her. And in that fight, she saw the man he truly was. When the smoke cleared, bodies lay sprawled in the dust, and the survivors fled deeper into the canyon. Whispered sat motionless for a moment, his chest heaving, his hand trembling slightly on the gun. Then he turned to her, his voice rough but unwavering. "It hurts," he said, the words torn from somewhere deep. "But I want more. I want you, even if it costs me everything." Sweetheart's throat tightened. In the heart of violence, in the shadow of death, she had found something she thought she'd buried forever. Hope. When they returned from the canyon, dragging behind them the remnants of the stolen herd, the town was waiting. Men stood stiff along the street, hands resting on rifle barrels, and women clutched their children close as though they expected Whispered Mustang himself to bare outlaw teeth and turn on them. Silence stretched so thick it pressed down like the weight of a storm. Sweetheart felt it in her bones. Every step of her horse's hooves struck against the ground like a drumbeat, announcing not victory but suspicion. She had ridden into danger alongside Whispered, had seen him fight not like a bandit but like a man defending the last scrap of good left in him. But the town didn't see that. They saw only the gun in his hand, the outlaws who had known his name, the blood that stained his shirt. The sheriff met them at the hitching rail, his face carved in stone. "You brought back cattle," he said, his voice rough with something caught between gratitude and accusation. "But you brought back ghosts too," Whispered didn't flinch. He tied off his reins, his movement slow, deliberate. "I didn't start this fight, but I'll finish it." Sweetheart dismounted quietly, though every muscle in her body still hummed from the echo of gunfire. She wanted to speak, to plead his case, but the eyes watching them were hungry for a reason to condemn. She knew well enough that words in the West were brittle things. Deeds mattered, scars mattered, and Whispered Mustang bore both in full measure. They retreated to the edge of town, to the half-ruined cabin where the storm had once trapped them together. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the walls, and in that dim glow Whispered finally let the mask slip. His hands trembled as he cleaned his revolver, his breath uneven as if each inhale carried the memory of the canyon. Sweetheart moved to him, her fingers brushing the scar at his temple. "You saved me," she said softly, though her voice quivered. "You saved them, whether they'll admit it or not." His jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the fire. "They don't care. To them, I'll always be the outlaw who didn't hang. And maybe they're right. Maybe no matter how far I ride, the dust of it clings to me." She knelt beside him, her face inches from his, her voice firm though it rose from a place of fear and longing. "You're not the man they think you are. I've seen you. I've seen the way you carry pain like it's a saddle you can't lay down." But Whispered, she used his name like a vow, "You're more than that. You're mine." Those words broke him, not in weakness but in a way that stripped away years of silence. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were the last unbroken thing in a world gone hard. His lips brushed against her temple, not with hunger but with reverence. And for the first time in years, Whispered Mustang allowed himself to believe that he might deserve more than survival. But the West never allowed happiness to bloom without threat. In the days that followed, riders came through with news. The outlaws had regrouped in the Badlands, their numbers swelled by drifters and cutthroats. The canyon skirmish had not ended the war. It had only drawn blood. And now the leader of that band, the rattlesnake-eyed man who had once ridden at Whispered's side, had sworn vengeance. The town grew restless. Men hammered boards across windows. Women whispered prayers at night, yet their fear twisted toward Whispered as much as toward the danger outside. More than one mutter rose in the saloon that maybe it would be better to drive him out, to cut the noose before it strangled them all. Sweetheart heard those whispers. She felt them like thorns each time she walked to fetch water or gather flour. But she also noticed something else, the way Whispered carried himself in those days. He didn't argue, didn't beg the town to trust him. Instead, he worked harder than ever, repairing fences, breaking horses, hauling stone for a widow's crumbling chimney. He moved with quiet determination as if to say, "Judge me if you must, but you will see who I am and what I do." At night, when the cabin was quiet and the fire burned low, Sweetheart lay awake beside him, listening to the rhythm of his breath. She thought of the vow he had spoken in the canyon, of the words that still echoed in her chest. "It hurts, but I want more." She wondered if she was strong enough to give it. She wondered if she was strong enough to hold him through what was coming, because she knew as surely as the moon rose over the prairie, that the outlaws would return. And when they did, the town would force Whispered to stand alone or force him out. And if he was cast out, She would have to choose whether to follow him into the wilderness or remain safe within walls built on mistrust. Sweetheart had survived too much to be afraid of hunger or cold. What terrified her now was something far more dangerous, the thought of losing him before she had even had the chance to love him fully. The meeting was called at dusk, when the last rays of the sun bled across the plains and turned the town's single street to fire. Men gathered in the saloon, their voices low but sharp, their faces hard with fear. Women lingered in doorways, arms folded tight across their chests, their eyes darting to the cabin where Whispered and Sweetheart stayed. The town was afraid, and fear in the West rarely bred mercy. The sheriff stood at the center, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver as though it gave him authority. "We all know what's coming," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "Those outlaws ain't gone. They're regrouping, and when they ride back, they'll ride hard. This town is small. We don't have the guns, we don't have the men. What we do have is one problem we can solve." He didn't say Whispered's name, but he didn't have to. Every head turned toward the cabin, as if the mere shadow of the man cursed them. Sweetheart stood outside the saloon swinging doors, listening. She had come to fetch flour from the mercantile, but her feet froze when the sheriff spoke. The words pricked like barbs, and she felt the weight of them settle heavy in her chest. They were turning against him. After all he had done, after the cattle, after the storm, after facing the canyon, they still chose fear over truth. Inside, a rancher slammed his fist on the table. "Drive him out. Let the outlaws take him if they want him so bad. Better one man fall than the whole town burn." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Sweetheart's hands trembled, but she pushed through the doors before she could stop herself. The room fell silent, every eye swinging toward her. She stood in the dim light, her shawl pulled tight, her breath unsteady but her voice clear. "You call yourselves men," she said, her words cutting through the hush. "Yet you'd send another to die so you can hide behind your wives and children? Whispered Mustang fought for you when no one else would. He brought back your cattle. He bled for your safety, and still you talk about throwing him to the wolves." A bitter laugh rose from the back. "He fought for himself. Don't think we didn't hear how those outlaws knew his name. He's one of them, and he'll drag you down with him, girl." Sweetheart's heart hammered, but she lifted her chin higher. "He's not one of them anymore. And if you can't see that, then it's not him who's weak, it's you." Gasps filled the room, but she didn't wait for an answer. She turned and left, her boots striking hard against the boards. Outside, the sky had turned black, the air cold enough to bite. She hurried back to the cabin, every step echoing the truth she could no longer deny. The town would betray him. They already had. When she pushed open the cabin door, Whispered was sitting by the fire, his revolver in pieces on the table, cleaning it with slow, methodical movements. He didn't look up when she entered, but he spoke, his voice low. "I know what they're saying." She stopped, breath catching. "Then why do you stay? Why keep fighting for people who'll never see you as more than what you were?" Finally, he looked at her. The firelight caught the lines of his face, the shadows beneath his eyes. "Because if I leave, they'll suffer. And I've made enough people suffer in my life." His words struck her deeper than any bullet. He wasn't staying for the town's sake, he was staying for redemption, for the chance to pay back the debts of his past in sweat and blood. She crossed the room and dropped to her knees before him, taking his scarred hands in hers. "You don't owe them your life," she whispered fiercely. "If they cast you out, I'll go with you. I won't let them take you." His fingers tightened around hers, trembling despite his strength. For a moment, silence filled the cabin, broken only by the crackle of fire. Then he leaned forward, his forehead resting against hers, his voice breaking on the edge of a whisper. "Sweetheart, if you go with me, you won't ever come back. It'll be the wilderness, the outlaws, the law, nothing but running. Are you ready to live that way?" Her answer came not in words, but in the fierceness of her grip, in the way her tears slid down and mingled with the dirt on his skin. She was ready, because she already knew what she could not live without. Him. But fate, as always, gave them no time to decide. A rider came pounding into town the next morning, his horse lathered, his face ashen. The outlaws were on the move, scores of them, cutting across the plains with fire in their wake. The sheriff called for the men to arm themselves, but it was too late. The fight was coming, and it would not be contained to the canyon this time. In the cabin, Whispered buckled his holster, his jaw set. Sweetheart stood at the doorway watching him, her heart caught between terror and devotion. "It hurts," he murmured, almost to himself, as he checked the revolver one last time. Then his eyes met hers, steady and certain. "But I want more. And if we survive this, sweetheart, I'll prove to you that even a Mustang can be tamed, not by chains but by love. The dawn came like a blade, slicing the horizon with a thin, merciless light. The town held its breath, every shutter drawn, every rifle loaded, every prayer whispered into the silence. Dust rose on the far ridge, a storm of hooves and rage, the outlaws riding hard for vengeance. From the cabin window, Sweetheart watched them appear, a dark wave of men, faces twisted by hunger and cruelty, their banners nothing but smoke and gunfire. Her throat tightened, her body trembling, but she did not step back. Instead, she gripped the rifle Whispered had placed in her hands, its weight unfamiliar but steady. She was no longer the woman who had arrived on the stagecoach, fragile and desperate for safety. She was a woman with something worth fighting for. Whispered stood beside her, his revolver holstered at his hip, his eyes steady as he surveyed the riders. The firelight of the night before had given way to steel, and in that moment he seemed carved from the same stone as the canyon walls, unyielding, weathered but alive with quiet power. "They'll come through the street," he said calmly. "We'll meet them here. If they break us, the town falls. If we hold them—" His voice trailed, but the weight of the words lingered. Sweetheart nodded. "Then we hold." The first shots cracked across the plains, echoing like thunder. The outlaws charged, their cries fierce, their bullets tearing through the wooden fences. Townsfolk fired from windows, smoke filling the air. But the outlaws pressed harder, fueled by vengeance and greed. Whispered moved like a shadow, his revolver flashing, his body never still. He fired with the precision of a man who had lived too long with a gun in his hand, each shot dropping a rider, each movement sparing someone else's life. The people of the town saw him then, not as an outlaw but as a shield, as the reason they still drew breath. Sweetheart fought at his side, her hands shaking at first, but her aim true when it mattered. She saw faces in her sights, men who would have destroyed everything she had built, everything she had begun to believe she deserved. And each time she pulled the trigger, she whispered a silent vow. "I will not go back to fear. Not ever again." The battle raged until the street was choked with smoke and blood. The outlaw leader emerged from the chaos, his rattlesnake eyes fixed on Whispered. He dismounted with a grin that split his scarred face. "There you are," he drawled, his voice carrying across the din. "Thought you could run, thought you could change. But men like us, we end the same way. In dirt." The two men faced each other, the past hanging heavy between them. Whispered's revolver trembled slightly in his hand. Not from fear, but from the weight of memory. He had ridden with this man, shared fire and blood, but now they stood on opposite sides of a truth Whispered could no longer deny. "You're right," Whispered said, his voice low, steady. "We all end in dirt, but it's how we live before then that matters." The outlaw snarled, his hand flashing to his pistol. The draw was fast, but Whispered was faster. One shot rang out, echoing through the smoke, and when the dust cleared, the rattlesnake-eyed man lay still on the ground. Silence followed, heavy and profound. The surviving outlaws broke, scattering into the hills, leaving their dead behind. The townsfolk emerged slowly, their faces pale, their rifles clutched tight. They looked to Whispered, their eyes filled with something new, something like respect or perhaps awe. But Whispered didn't seek their approval. He turned instead to Sweetheart, his chest heaving, his eyes raw. Blood streaked his sleeve, his body bruised, but his gaze was clear. "It hurts," he whispered, his voice frayed but resolute. "God, it hurts. But Sweetheart," his hand reached for hers, trembling yet unyielding, "I still want more. I want a life with you, not as an outlaw, not as a ghost, as a man who's found his home." Her tears fell freely, her heart aching with the enormity of it. She cupped his face in her hands, her voice fierce and unbroken. "Then take it, take me, because I don't care what the town says or what shadows follow us. You are my home, and I will never let you ride alone again." The town might never fully accept him. The West would never grow gentle. Storms would always come and wolves would always circle. But in that moment, beneath the wide and endless sky, Whispered Mustang and Sweetheart chose more than survival. They chose love, not fragile, not fleeting, but a fire fierce enough to burn through every hardship the land could throw at them.